Winter 1944. A hospital behind the American lines. A soldier who was wounded a few weeks ago and who has healed enough to be sent back to duty is doing something that the clerks processing him find unremarkable and that would have astonished a German officer watching it. He is arguing, insisting, pulling every string he can find, not to be sent home. He is well enough that home is not on offer, but to be sent back to one specific place, his own outfit, the company he was wounded with, the men he left behind in the line, because the system, left to itself, will not send him there. The system will take him, a healed and available body, and route him to wherever a body is needed, into a replacement stream that will drop him, alone, into some other company of strangers who happen to be short a man, and he does not want that. He would rather go back to the unit where people are being shot at, to the men he knows, than to a safer billet full of men he does not. And this is not one strange soldier. This is a pattern, common enough that it is written all through the memoirs and the letters and the histories. Men slipping out of hospitals before they were fully healed to get back to their units. Men refusing comfortable rear jobs to return to the line. Men who, given a legitimate chance to stay out of the fighting, fought instead to get back into it, not out of bloodlust, and not out of patriotism in any abstract sense, but to get back to a particular dozen men in a particular hole in the ground. If you were a German officer and you understood this behavior, it would not fit your model of how soldiers work, and it would not fit it in a way that should have frightened you, because it pointed at a strength you could not match. The German conclusion, to the extent the phenomenon was noticed, would tend toward the dismissive. The Americans are sentimental. They are undisciplined. They form these attachments and let them override military logic. A soldier goes where he is ordered and serves in whatever unit the army assigns him. This business of a man having feelings about which company he belongs to is soft, personal, unmilitary. That conclusion misses everything, because the thing the American soldier was fighting to get back to was not sentiment. It was the single most powerful force in combat, the thing that actually makes men fight, and the American army had come to understand it, and to protect it, and to build around it, in a way the German army, for all its brilliance, structurally could not. Here is the finding, and it came out of the war itself, from researchers who went and asked soldiers directly what kept them going. And the answer was not the flag. It was not hatred of the enemy. It was not ideology or the cause or the nation. Those things barely registered when men were honest. What kept a man fighting was the other men in his small unit. The dozen or so soldiers he lived with, ate with, was terrified with. He fought so as not to let them down. He fought because they were watching. He fought because they were his, and he was theirs, and the bond between them was, by the end, stronger than his fear, and stronger than his sense, and sometimes stronger than his will to live. That bond is the atom of combat power. It is the thing everything else rests on. And a wounded man fighting to get back to his unit was not being sentimental. He was trying to get back to the only thing that had ever made the unbearable bearable. And, though he would not have put it this way, he was demonstrating the exact mechanism that made the American army so hard to break. This is not a story about hospitals, or about loyalty in the abstract. This is a forensic audit of the most important weapon in any army, which is not a weapon at all, the bond between men in a small unit, and of how one army learned to protect and preserve it as a strategic asset, while the other, through no malice but through sheer attrition, destroyed it faster than it could form. Part 1. The German Calculus. We have to start by giving the Germans their due, because on this specific subject, the bond between men in a small unit, the German army was not ignorant. It was, in fact, expert. Arguably, it understood small unit cohesion better than anyone. The German army had always known that men fight for each other, not for grand causes. Its entire tactical doctrine, its whole culture of the small unit, its emphasis on comradeship, Kameradschaft, was built on a deep, correct understanding that the fighting power of an army lives in the bonds between men at the bottom. German training deliberately fostered these bonds. German small units were famous for their cohesion, their mutual loyalty, their willingness to fight on for each other long after any rational hope was gone. This was one of the genuine sources of German combat effectiveness, and it was real, and it lasted, in many units, right to the end. So the German problem here is not that they failed to understand the thing, they understood it perfectly. Their problem is that they could not protect it, because the war destroyed the conditions that create it, and by the last years there was nothing they could do about it. A bond between men takes time to form. It is built out of shared experience, shared danger, shared ordinary life. Weeks and months of a stable group of men living together, learning each other, coming to trust each other. You cannot manufacture it instantly. You cannot order it into existence. It grows. And growing takes time and stability. And time and stability were exactly what the German army ran out of. Because the German replacement situation, by the last years of the war, was catastrophic, and it worked directly against cohesion in every way. Units were kept in the line until they were destroyed, then rebuilt from whatever replacements could be found, then thrown back in and destroyed again. The stable group that cohesion requires never had a chance to exist. A German infantry company in the last year of the war might be a constantly churning mixture of a few exhausted survivors and a stream of green replacements who arrived and died before anyone even learned their names. And this created a vicious phenomenon that German veterans described with real anguish. The veterans stopped learning the names of the new men, not out of coldness, but out of self-protection, because the new men died so fast and so predictably that to form an attachment to them was simply to invite more grief than a man could carry. So the replacements arrived into a unit that could not take them in, that held them at arm's length precisely because they were so likely to die, and held at arm's length, outside the protective bond, they died at even higher rates, because the bond was the thing that kept men alive, and they were outside it. It is a death spiral of exactly the kind we keep finding in this series, but this time made of human relationships. Attrition destroys the stable group. Without the stable group, the bond cannot form. Without the bond, the isolated replacement dies faster. His death feeds the attrition. And around it goes the cohesion that was the German army's great strength, being ground away by the very intensity of the fighting that the cohesion had once made possible. The German soldier, by the end, was often fighting alone even when surrounded by other soldiers, a survivor among strangers, his own original band of brothers long dead, the new men around him unknown and unknowable because they would not last. The magnificent Kameradschaft was still real in the surviving corps, and where it survived, it was as strong as ever. But across the army as a whole, it was being destroyed faster than it could regenerate, and there was no mechanism, no system, no policy that could rebuild it, because the one thing it needed, stability, time, a group that stayed together, was the one thing the collapsing German war effort could not provide. That is the German calculus, a perfect understanding of the bond between men, and a total inability to protect it. An attrition so severe that units could not stay stable long enough for cohesion to form. Veterans who stopped learning the names of the replacements because the replacements died too fast. And an army whose greatest human strength was being consumed by the very fire it had once fed, with no way to put anything back. Now let us look at how the Americans came to treat that bond as something to be deliberately preserved. Part 2. The American Answer. The American army did not begin the war understanding this, and its record on it is genuinely mixed, and we have to be honest about that from the start, because the American replacement system contained one of the worst failures of the entire war, and also, eventually, one of its most important insights. Start with the failure, because it came first, and it was real. The American individual replacement system, the one the wounded soldier in our opening was fighting against, was, for much of the war, a machine that treated soldiers as interchangeable parts in the most literal and damaging sense. It took men as individuals, processed them through replacement depots that the soldiers bitterly nicknamed with a word meaning a place where cattle are held, and fed them forward, one at a time, into whatever unit was short a body. A new man would arrive alone, at night, into a company of exhausted strangers in the line, knowing no one, known by no one, and he would go into his first combat outside any protective bond, among men who, exactly like the Germans, had learned not to attach themselves to replacements who died so fast. And they died fast. The statistics on individual replacements are grim. A new man dropped alone into a veteran unit was far more likely to be killed or wounded in his first days than a man who had come up with the unit, precisely because he lacked the bond, the local knowledge, the protective web of relationships that experience and cohesion provide. The system took the most vulnerable men and stripped them of the one thing that might have protected them. It was known at the time. It was criticized at the time. And for a long time it was not fixed, because it was administratively efficient. It filled holes quickly, and its human cost was borne by the men, not by the paperwork. So the American Army was, at first, guilty of exactly the sin its abundance elsewhere let it avoid. It treated men as fungible. It ignored the bond. But here is the difference, and it is the difference that runs through this entire series. The Americans studied their own failure, and named it, and, unevenly, incompletely, but genuinely, began to correct it. The insight came from that combat research we have mentioned, the deliberate, systematic study of what actually made soldiers fight and what made them break. And the research kept returning the same answer. The small unit bond was everything. Men fought for their buddies. Cohesion was the true source of combat power and the true protection against breakdown. And it followed inescapably that anything which destroyed cohesion was destroying combat power, and that the individual replacement system, however administratively tidy, was quietly wrecking the very thing that won battles. And so American practice began, over the course of the war, and especially after it, to shift toward preserving the group. The recognition grew that you should, wherever possible, keep men with their units, rotate and rest units as whole units, rather than stripping and refilling them. Return a recovered wounded man to his own outfit, rather than dropping him among strangers, which is exactly what the soldier in our opening was fighting for, and exactly what the more enlightened parts of the system came to try to provide. Bring replacements forward in groups where possible, and integrate them deliberately, pairing them with veterans, rather than dumping them in alone. Late in the war, some formations experimented with better methods, introducing replacements in quieter periods, giving them a few days to be absorbed into the unit before combat, assigning veterans to mentor them. These efforts were partial and inconsistent, but they pointed in a clear direction, and that direction became, after the war, settled doctrine. Cohesion is a weapon, protect it, and never again treat the individual soldier as an interchangeable part to be fed alone into a machine. And underneath the policy was the same philosophy we have found everywhere in this series, seen from one more angle. The German system, even where it understood cohesion, treated the soldier ultimately as a resource to be spent, and could not afford to protect his bonds. The American system came to treat the soldier as a person whose relationships were themselves a military asset worth preserving, and, not coincidentally, whose relationships were the thing that made him willing to fight at all. The wounded American fighting his way back to his own unit was not fighting the American ideal. He was embodying it. He understood in his body what the researchers had proven on paper, that the men in that specific hole in the ground were the reason to go on, and that going back to them, even into danger, was better than the safest billet among strangers. And the best parts of his army had come to understand that his instinct was not sentimental weakness, but the deepest military wisdom there is, and had begun, at last, to build a system that honored it. Part 3. The River of Steel. Now, this being this channel, we have to ask where the material abundance comes in. Because cohesion sounds like the one thing in this whole series that money cannot buy. And in a sense that is true, and in a sense it is exactly wrong, and the distinction matters. You cannot manufacture a bond between men. No factory produces Kameradschaft. On that, the romantic view is correct. But you can manufacture the conditions in which bonds survive. And that is an industrial and logistical achievement, and it is where American abundance quietly did its work. What does a bond between men need in order to survive? It needs the men to survive. A bond is destroyed most completely by death, and everything that kept American soldiers alive, the medical chain, the crew survivability, the body armor of overwhelming firepower, the rotation that pulled exhausted units out before they were annihilated, was, indirectly, a cohesion-preserving system. Every man the medical system saved was a man who could return to his unit and keep the bond alive. Every unit that was rotated out to rest, instead of being destroyed in place, was a unit whose web of relationships survived to fight another day. American abundance kept men alive, and living men keep their bonds. Dead men cannot. And the American ability to rest and rotate whole units, which we examined in an earlier audit, and which rested entirely on having enough formations to have some in reserve, was, at its heart, a cohesion-preserving machine. A unit pulled out intact to rest comes back with its bonds intact. A unit destroyed in the line and rebuilt from replacements comes back as a group of strangers. The Germans, with no reserves, had to do the second. The Americans, with depth, could increasingly do the first. The difference between them was manpower abundance, and the product of that abundance was not just rested men, but preserved relationships. Even the replacement reform, partial as it was, depended on abundance. To bring replacements forward in groups, to give them time to integrate, to return men to their own units rather than routing them wherever a hole existed, all of that is less efficient, in the narrow sense, than the brutal individual replacement machine. It requires slack. It requires enough men that you do not have to fill every hole with the nearest available body the instant it opens. Only an army with manpower depth can afford to prioritize cohesion over the immediate filling of gaps. And America, for all that even it felt the pinch, had that depth where Germany did not. So the thing that could not be manufactured, the bond itself, was protected by all the things that could be: the medicine, the survivability, the rotation, the manpower depth. Every one of them, whatever its primary purpose, was also quietly in the business of keeping men alive and together long enough for the bonds between them to hold. The Americans could not build cohesion in a factory, but they could build in their factories everything that cohesion needed in order to survive, and they did, and it held, and it was one of the deep reasons their army did not break. Part 4. The German realization. The Germans understood, better than almost anyone, what was happening to their own cohesion, because they were living inside its destruction, and many of them wrote about it with piercing clarity. German veterans' accounts return again and again to the loss of the old comrades, the churn of nameless replacements, the strange isolation of surviving into a unit that was no longer the unit you had bonded with. They understood that the thing which had made the German infantry so formidable, the deep loyalty of the small group, was being ground away, and that its loss was hollowing out the army from the inside, even where the numbers on paper looked adequate. A company at full strength on paper, composed of strangers, is not the same fighting instrument as a company at half strength, composed of men who have fought together for a year, and the Germans knew it, and could measure the difference in the field, and could do nothing about it. And there is a specific, poignant recognition in the German assessments of the Americans, which is that the American army, which they had dismissed as a sentimental collection of individualists, turned out to possess a resilience they could not account for. American units absorbed punishment and did not break. They took losses that should have shattered their cohesion and somehow retained enough of it to keep functioning. The Germans, masters of cohesion themselves, were watching an enemy sustain the thing that they, the masters, were losing. And the reason was not that the Americans loved each other more, but that the American system was keeping enough of them alive and enough of them together for the bonds to survive the losses. The deepest German realization then, available to the most perceptive of them, was this. They had understood cohesion as a matter of spirit, of comradeship, of loyalty, of the human heart. And they were right that it was those things. But they had missed that cohesion was also a matter of logistics, that whether the bond survived depended, in the end, on whether the men survived and stayed together, and that this was a question of medicine and manpower and rotation and replacement policy as much as of the heart. The Americans, more by system than by sentiment, had protected the material conditions of cohesion, and so their cohesion survived. The Germans, who had more sentiment and less system, watched their cohesion die for lack of the material conditions to sustain it. The bond is of the heart, but the heart needs the body to survive, and the body needs the system, and the Americans had the system. The German officer who saw an American fighting to rejoin his unit and called it sentiment was looking at the visible tip of an invisible machine, a machine that kept men alive and kept them together, and thereby preserved the one weapon that no factory can build and no army can win without. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle fought to get back to his unit, slipped out of a hospital early, turned down a safer job, did whatever it took to return to the men he had been wounded with, I would be grateful to hear his name and his unit in the comments. That instinct, which the paperwork could not understand, was the truest thing in the whole war. And if he spent the rest of his life closer to those men than to almost anyone, and never quite had the words for why, that belongs in the record too. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. 1945. The war ends, and among all the lessons drawn from it, one of the most important and most lasting is about the thing we have been discussing, the bond between men, and its central place in whether armies fight or break. The post-war studies confirmed what the wartime research had found, and what the wounded man fighting to rejoin his unit already knew in his body. Men fight for each other. Cohesion is the foundation of combat power. And any system that destroys cohesion, however efficient it looks on paper, is destroying the army's ability to fight, whatever the numbers say. This became bedrock military understanding, and armies have organized themselves around it ever since, precisely because the Second World War demonstrated its truth at such terrible cost. So here is the verdict. The German army understood the bond between men as well as any army ever has, and it built its whole tactical excellence upon it. And then it was forced, by attrition and by a collapsing war effort, to destroy the very conditions that bond required, until its greatest strength was being consumed faster than it could regenerate, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The American army understood the bond late, and treated it carelessly at first, and committed real cruelties through a replacement system that ignored it, and then studied its own failure, and named it, and began to build systems to protect what it had learned to value, keeping men alive, keeping units together, returning the healed man to his own outfit, preserving the web of relationships that was the true source of the Army's resilience. And the difference, in the end, was not that the Americans felt the bond more deeply. In many cases, they felt it less deeply than the Germans, whose Kameradschaft was a thing of legend. The difference was that the Americans built the machine that let the bond survive, the medicine, the survivability, the rotation, the manpower depth, and eventually the wiser handling of replacements, while the Germans, for all the depth of their comradeship, could not keep enough of their men alive and together for the comradeship to endure. The bond is the weapon, and the Americans, by keeping men alive and together, kept the weapon, and the Germans, unable to do either, lost it, even as they understood it better than anyone. The German officer who watched an American fight his way back to his unit and saw only sentiment and indiscipline was looking at the most formidable thing in any army, a man who had been given something worth going back to, and a system that had kept it alive for him to go back to. The Germans could feel the bond more deeply than anyone. The Americans could keep it alive, and in a long war, keeping it alive was everything. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these. More systems, more decisions, more of the invisible, unglamorous machinery that decided who won and who came home. And remember this, about the men who went back. Nobody quite makes a film about the deepest truth of that war, which is that it was not fought, at the sharp end, for flags or for nations or for grand ideas. It was fought by frightened men, for the other frightened men beside them, and the willingness to die for those men was the truest and most terrible love most of them would ever know. The wounded man who fought his way out of a hospital to get back to his unit was not being brave in the way the word is usually meant. He was going back to the people he could not bear to leave in danger without him. He would rather be shot at beside them than safe without them. That is not sentiment. That is the thing itself, the bond that wins wars and breaks hearts, the reason ordinary men do impossible things, the closest thing to unconditional love that most of them would ever feel, forged in the worst place on earth, and carried, by the ones who survived, for the rest of their lives. They deserve to be remembered by name, by unit, and by the plain, shattering truth that they fought for each other, and that a nation wise enough to keep them alive and together had, in that bond, a weapon that no factory could build and no enemy could match.